The old house stood silhouetted against the bruised twilight sky, its windows like vacant eyes staring into the deepening gloom. It had been home to the Clotilde family for generations, each brick imbued with secrets and whispered tales. But now, a suffocating dread clung to it, a palpable entity that could turn the blood cold. The story of No Volté, or Don't Turn Back, began here, with an elderly woman named Mrs. Clotilde, her memory fading like an old photograph, and her children, Aurora and Martin, drawn back into its malevolent embrace. Mrs. Clotilde, once the matriarch of a vibrant family, was now a fragile shell of her former self. Her mind was a labyrinth of fading memories and terrifying visions. Her only connection to reality was Lalo, a kind soul who brought her groceries and tended to the household chores. But even Lalo could not penetrate the growing darkness that was enveloping her life. He would arrive at the house, the familiar path feeling more ominous with each visit. He would call out, "Mrs. Clotilde, it's Lalo," his voice echoing in the unnerving silence that seemed to absorb sound itself. One fateful day, no answer greeted him. He pushed the door open cautiously, the wood groaning like a tormented spirit. The house seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting. Lalo's footsteps echoed on the aged wooden floors. The TV flickered silently in the living room, devoid of its usual cheerful glow. A cold draft brushed his face, though the windows were all closed. He felt a prickling sensation on his skin, as if an unseen presence was watching him. He called out again, his voice laced with growing unease. "Mrs. Clotilde." The silence that followed was deafening. He ventured into the kitchen, the scent of dust and decay thick in the air. The groceries in his arms felt heavy, their familiar weight adding to the oppressive atmosphere. He struggled with the old wooden cabinet, the door resisting his efforts with an unnatural stubbornness. He hauled a chair closer, his heart thudding in his chest. As he stood on the wobbly seat to reach the stubborn latch, he heard a chilling sound behind him, a soft, scraping sound that made his blood run cold. He turned, his eyes darting around the room. A shadowy figure stood there, a blurred silhouette that seemed to coalesce from the very darkness itself. Lalo's heart hammered against his ribs, a trapped bird desperate to escape. Could it be Mrs. Clotilde? But then he saw her in the garden through the window, tending to the flowers, oblivious to the entity within the house. His mind struggled to make sense of the impossible. The figure seemed to sway, a dark stain against the pale walls, before it vanished into the thin air. Lalo's breath hitched in his throat. He wanted to run, to escape the suffocating terror that filled the room. But before he could move, the table beneath him shuddered violently. Then the world tilted, and he crashed to the floor amidst a cacophony of falling dishes and splintering wood. The invisible force seemed to mock him, an unseen malevolence taking pleasure in his fear. He scrambled to his feet, the coldness of the floor seeping into his bones. Lalo backed away, his eyes wide with terror, and fled from the house, his screams caught by the uncaring wind. This was the beginning of the unraveling, the moment when the veil between worlds thinned, letting the horror bleed into reality. In another part of the city, Aurora, Mrs. Clotilde's daughter, was haunted by her own demons. She was grappling with a broken relationship, the pain of her recent breakup still raw and bleeding. The silence of her apartment felt heavier than usual, broken only by the ticking of a clock that seemed to count down to some unknown doom. One night, as she lay restless in her bed, a voice whispered behind her, a ghostly breath against her ear, "No Volté." The warning chilled her to the core, resonating with a primal fear that had long been dormant. She spun around, her eyes wide with terror, but found nothing but the empty room. She tried to convince herself it was just a trick of her mind, a product of her stress, but the unease lingered, a dark seed planted in her soul. Aurora began to experience vivid nightmares, each more terrifying than the last. She was always in the old house, its shadows stretching and twisting like living things. The voice returned, "Don't turn back," repeating over and over. She would wake up drenched in sweat, her heart pounding like a war drum in her chest. She felt like she was losing her mind, the line between dream and reality becoming blurred and indistinct. Then one morning, her phone rang, the shrill sound shattering the fragile silence. It was Martin, her brother, born just 4 minutes after her. She hadn't spoken to him in weeks, their lives having diverged in recent years. But his voice sounded shaken, laced with an urgency that was impossible to ignore. He spoke of their mother, of her worsening condition. He said that things were not as they should be at the house, and that he thought she needed to come home. Martin explained that he had been at the house the day before. His voice was low, as if he was afraid of being overheard. He kept glancing over his shoulder, as though someone or something was right behind him. He spoke of strange sounds, of the heavy silence that seemed to suffocate the house. He confessed to her of a dark presence, but his explanation had been filled with hesitancy and fear, a truth he couldn't dare to admit. Aurora knew she had to go back. She had to face the shadows that clung to her family's home. She had to find out what was happening to her mother, to her family. The old warning echoed in her mind as she drove toward the house. No Volté. The phrase was no longer a nightmare. It was a command, a chilling directive in the face of a terrifying unknown. As she approached the house, the air grew colder, a stark contrast to the warmth of the summer day. The house seemed to loom before her, a dark silhouette against the skyline. A sense of dread washed over her, a premonition of the horrors that lay within. She hesitated for a moment, her hand hovering over the door knocker. She knocked, the sound echoing in the oppressive silence. Then she heard a voice behind her, Martin's voice, calling her name. But the warning flashed through her mind, and she refused to turn. She could feel his presence behind her, his breath on her neck, but she held firm. He touched her, his hand cold and clammy, and only then did she turn, embracing him with a relief that was quickly replaced by a sense of unease. They entered the house together, the front door creaking as if lamenting their return. The air inside was heavy and stagnant, the silence broken by strange whispers that seemed to come from the very walls. Aurora noticed a strange change in the house, something unsettling. Her mother, in her increasingly demented state, had begun to remove her father's face from all the family photos. The portraits, once filled with happy memories, now seemed to be leering at them with empty eyes. Martin explained that he found her doing this just yesterday, as if she had tried to erase his presence from the world. The siblings sat in the living room, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Martin told her about Lalo's death, how he had fallen at the house. But their mother seemed unaware of the tragedy, her mind lost in the fog of dementia. This revelation chilled Aurora to the bone. How could her mother not know about Lalo? Something was very wrong. She looked over to Martin, but his eyes seemed distant. She wondered what he was hiding and what he knew. Aurora decided to confront her mother. She found her in the garden, surrounded by wilting flowers. Mrs. Clotilde's eyes were vacant, her face lined with confusion. Aurora tried to talk to her, to ask her about Lalo, about the strange things that had been happening. But her mother's words were disjointed and nonsensical, her memories fragmented and distorted. It became clear that her dementia was deepening, her mind a battleground for warring realities. But there was something else there, an undercurrent of something sinister, as if something had taken root in her consciousness, corrupting her sanity. As the days turned into nights, the house seemed to grow more malevolent. Strange noises echoed in the hallways, and shadows danced in the corners of her eyes. The whispers grew louder and more frequent, repeating the same chilling warning, no Volté. Aurora's sleep was plagued by nightmares, and her waking hours were filled with a constant sense of dread. She felt like she was being watched, stalked by unseen eyes. She suspected that her mother was no longer just senile, she had become some sort of conduit. Martin seemed distant, and she was starting to suspect him as well. One night, Aurora was awakened by a chilling scream. She raced to her mother's room, but she found her bed empty. The window was open, a cold breeze swirling through the room. She searched the house, her heart pounding in her chest. She finally found her mother in the attic, a dark and dusty space filled with forgotten memories. But she wasn't alone. A shadowy figure stood beside her, its form indistinct and chilling. Mrs. Clotilde reached for a picture, and Aurora watched in horror as her mother's nails were transformed into long and sharp claws, and she took to scratching and tearing at the picture. Aurora knew that it was her father in the picture. Her heart clenched, the image forever burned in her mind. Aurora tried to grab her mother, but the shadowy figure lunged at her. She stumbled back, fear constricting her throat. The figure seemed to grow larger, its form twisting and contorting. She realized with a terrifying certainty that it was not human. It was something else, something ancient and malevolent. She could feel its hatred, a palpable wave of darkness that threatened to consume her. Martin appeared at the top of the stairs. his face contorted with terror. He shouted her name, but his voice sounded distant, as if filtered through a thick fog. He was trying to warn her, but what was it? She couldn't turn back. Aurora stood there, paralyzed by fear, as the shadow descended upon her. She remembered the voice, "No Volté." It echoed in her mind, a chilling warning that she had long ignored. She realized with terrifying clarity that the warning was not about looking back. It was about something much deeper and more profound. It was about the past, the memories, the things that are best left buried. This house and her mother were being haunted by a curse that was rooted in the memories that they refused to let go. By looking back, by returning to the house, she was feeding the darkness, giving it the power it needed to consume them all. But it was too late. The shadow enveloped her, its icy grip tightening around her soul. She screamed, but no sound escaped her lips. The darkness closed in, and she knew, with a chilling finality, that she had turned back, and she would pay the ultimate price. She knew she would soon become another memory lost in the endless labyrinth of the old house, forever trapped in the shadows of no Volté. The last thing she saw was her mother's twisted smile as she finally finished disfiguring her father's picture. The shadowy figure beside her mother turned towards her with a wicked grin, the form of her own brother. The house stood silent once again, its windows like empty eyes staring into the darkness. But inside, the horror continued, the curse feeding on the despair and loss of those who dared to turn back. The movie No Volté was more than just a story. It was a warning, an echo from the depths of the subconscious, a chilling reminder that some things are better left undisturbed. The terror continues, repeating the same patterns over and over again, drawing in unsuspecting souls to the old house and their inevitable doom, all within the confines of the warning, no Volté. The story of the house will continue forever, until the last soul is consumed by its haunting memories, and the darkness can finally rest.